Chapter 6. Valve Timing. Removing and installing the camshaft. Removing the camshaft. Unscrew the camshaft bearing mounting bolts. Remove the camshaft bearing cover and place them in order. Unscrew the camshaft gear mounting bolts. Remove the camshaft pulse plate, and then remove the gear. Unscrew the bolts, and remove the camshaft intermediate gear with the intermediate gear pin. Installing the camshaft. Turn the inscribed side of the intermediate gear outwards. Apply clean engine oil on intermediate gear pin. Check whether it is smoothly rotated. Install it into the cylinder head from above. Align the intermediate gear with intermediate gear pin with the bores in the cylinder head. Screw the bolts through the gear hole to cylinder head, and then tighten them to 30 Nm. Apply 468 sealant evenly around the bowl plug. Knock the bowl plug into the cylinder head. Check end face of the bowl plug shall be 0 to 0.5 mm below the cylinder head. Align the jigger with OT line of flywheel. Cylinder 1 is at the top dead center of outburst. Wipe the camshaft bushing seat of cylinder head and bushing cover. Install the camshaft bushing and apply the lubricating oil evenly on it. The camshaft gear groove faces towards the camshaft. Align with the pinhole. Align the camshaft cover plate with the pinhole. Screw in and tighten 3 bolts with hands. Place the camshaft gently into the camshaft bearing of cylinder head. Note: the upper mark of camshaft gear shall be aligned with the machining face of the cylinder head intake tube. Install the camshaft bush cover. Note: align with the pinhole and install the bush cover and seat one by one correspondingly. One side of the harness groove faces the intake tube. Screw in 14 bolts and tighten them symmetrically to 24 Nm. Tighten the bolts of camshaft gear shaft, pre-tighten them to 50 Nm at first, and then turn 90 degrees. Rear timing gear. Installing and removing the rear timing gear. Unscrew the mounting bolts. Remove the large intermediate gear and gear shaft. Unscrew the mounting bolts. Remove the intermediate pinion and gear shaft. Pull the crankshaft gear out from the crankshaft. Unscrew the bolts. Remove the intermediate gear, gear shaft, and thrust washer of the air compressor. Installing the rear timing gear. The thick side of the intermediate gear of the air compressor faces the crankcase. Apply the lubricating oil on the intermediate gear of the air compressor. Align the gear with the thrust plate and turn. In case of a wrong direction of thrust plate, it is unable to align the bolt holes and install the bolts onto the crankcase. Tighten them to 150 Nm. The side of crankcase intermediate gear with much extrusion faces the crankcase. Apply lubricating oil evenly on the intermediate gear. Align with the gear and fix onto the crankcase with bolts to 30 Nm. The gear of large intermediate gear with dotted mark faces outward, and the side with small gear faces the crankcase. Apply lubricating oil evenly on the large intermediate gear, align with the gear, and fix on the crankcase with bolts. Tighten the bolts in 2 steps. First, tighten them diagonally to 150 Nm, and then turn 90 degrees and tighten them diagonally. Apply lubricating oil evenly on the junction surface between the rear gear of the crankshaft and the crankshaft, and tap the crankshaft rear gear in place gently with a rubber hammer. Note: position the teeth with dotted marks on the rear gear of the crankshaft at the dotted mark of the large intermediate gear. Align the locating pin on the rear gear of the crankshaft with the pinholes on the rear end face of the crankshaft. Check the clearance of rear end gear train. The clearance between the crankshaft rear gear and the large intermediate gear is 0.052 to 0.176 mm. That between the intermediate pinion and the crankcase intermediate gear is 0.052 to 0.176 mm, and that between the crankshaft rear gear and the air compressor intermediate gear is 0.051 to 0.177 mm. Chapter 7: Fuel Oil Supply System. Removing and installing the fuel injector. Removing the fuel injector. Unscrew the fixing nut. Remove the fuel injector conduit. And remove the harness. Unscrew the fixing bolts of fuel injector harness and remove the harness assembly. Unscrew the follower bolts of fuel injector. Use special tooling to remove the fuel injector and its plate. And remove the thrust block of fuel injector plate. Installing the fuel injector. Place the thrust block of fuel injector plate at the seal of cylinder head bowl plug. Before installing the injector, check if the gasket and sealing rim have been installed at the head of injector. Note: the gasket and sealing ring are one-off, and no oil is allowed at the sealing ring. Install the pressing block and the fuel injector together into cylinder head and press them tightly. Fix the pressing block with bolts spaced with spherical washer. Tighten the bolts of injector pressing block to 10 Nm. Ensure to rotate the bolts back for 45 degrees after pressing the injector in place. Install the sealing ring on the injector conduit gently from the air inlet side of cylinder head. When you hear a sound, the seal ring is installed in place. Tighten the pressing nuts with hands. Note: the injector conduit and seal ring are one-off. Check the injector conduit for impression at the conduit head. Tighten the bolts of injector pressing plate and pressing nuts of conduit alternatively in 4 steps. First, tighten the bolts of pressing plate by hands to 1 to 2 Nm. Second, tighten the pressing nuts to 10 Nm. Third, tighten the bolts to 25 Nm and turn 90 degrees. And finally, tighten the nuts to 20 Nm and turn 60 degrees. Align the injector harness assembly carefully through the hole on cylinder head and fasten it accordingly. Install the injector harness to 1.5 Nm. Removing and installing the high-pressure oil pipe. Removing the high-pressure oil pipe. Dismantle the high-pressure oil pipe of cylinder 1 to cylinder 6. Unscrew the fixing bolts of common rail assembly. Remove the common rail assembly. Installing the high-pressure oil pipe. Fix the common rail assembly onto the cylinder head with 3 bolts. Tighten them with hands to about 2 Newton meters. Install the high-pressure oil pipe of cylinder 1 to cylinder 6 in turn, and that of cylinder 3 is installed outside that of cylinder 4, both of which cross and form an X shape. The number on the nuts of high-pressure oil pipe corresponds to the cylinder sequence, as shown in the table. 0318 refers to the high-pressure oil pipe of cylinder 1, 0319 to that of cylinder 2, 0320 to that of cylinder 3, 0321 to that of cylinder 4, 0322 to that of cylinder 5, and 0323 to that of cylinder 6. Tighten the nuts to 10 Newton meters. Pay attention to the cleanliness of each parts during the assembly. During the assembly, adjust the high-pressure oil pipe to the center of nut. When tightening the nuts, tighten the injector end at first and then the common rail end. Tighten the common rail assembly to 30 to 40 Newton meters. Tighten the bolts from the middle to both sides, and then rotate the nuts of high-pressure oil pipe for 60 degrees. Removing and installing the fuel oil service center. Removing the fuel oil service center. Dismantle the hollow bolts and T-junction. Remove all the connectors of fuel line. Unscrew the bolts. Remove the fuel oil service center and its bracket. Installing the fuel oil service center. Install the bracket of fuel oil service center on the crankcase. Tighten the bolt to 35 Newton meters. Fix the fuel oil service center onto the brackets. Tighten the bolt to 30 Newton meters. Install the fuel line. Tighten the hollow bolts and T-junction, and the pipe joint nut shall be pre-tightened with a torque of 10 Newton meters, and then turn for an angle of 60 degrees. Removing and installing the high-pressure oil pump. Removing the high-pressure oil pump. Unscrew the nuts. Remove the oil pipe from the common rail assembly and high-pressure oil pump. Unscrew the fixing bolts and take the high-pressure oil pump down. Unscrew the bolts and take the belt pulley of the pump driving device down from the spleen shaft. Unscrew the fixing bolts. Remove the driving device of high-pressure oil pump. Installing the high-pressure oil pump. Apply 5900 sealant on the junction surface of high-pressure oil pump driving device. Note: the tree scrap shall be coherent and continuous. Locate and install the driving device of high-pressure oil pump. Tighten the bolts to 110 Nm. Apply 5900 sealant evenly on the gears of belt pulley. Install the belt pulley on the spleen shaft until resistance is encountered when pushing. Fix it onto transmission shaft with M12 bolts, with the tightening torque of 110 Nm. Apply the Vaseline evenly on the sealing ring. Install the clamp spring on the driving sleeve of oil pump with a circlip plier, so that the clamp spring falls within the clamp spring slot. Install the transmission shaft bushing on the big pump. Install the high-pressure oil pump on the housing. Screw in and tighten the 3 bolts to 65 Nm. Install the oil pipe onto the common rail assembly and the high-pressure oil pump. Adjust the high-pressure oil pipe to the center of the nut during assembly. Tighten the oil pipe with the initial torque of 10 Nm, and then rotate 60 degrees. Chapter 8: Engine Lubrication System. Removing and installing the oil module. Removing the oil module. Dismantle the pipeline of oil module. Note: drain out the antifreezing fluid before removing the oil module. Dismantle the angle-shaped flange and adapter pipe. Unscrew the bolts, 2 of which are fixing bolts of water pump, and shall be unscrewed together. And remove the oil module and washer. Installing the oil module. Install the oil module and washer. And tighten the bolts diagonally to 75 Nm. Install the angle-shaped flange and adapter pipe on which P80 lubricant is applied evenly, and connect the pipeline. Removing and installing the oil pan. Removing the oil pan. Unscrew the mounting bolts. Remove the oil pan supporting block, the oil pan and sealing gasket. Unscrew the mounting bolts and pull out the oil suction pipe from the crankcase. Installing the oil pan. Apply Vaseline on the O-ring seal. Install the O-ring seal into the crankcase and tighten the fixing bolts of oil suction pipe to 35 Nm. Install the sealing gasket on the oil pan. Check the cleanliness of oil pan before assembly to ensure free from contamination, paper scraps, chippings, or corrosion. Note: to install the oil pan onto the crankcase successfully at one time, do not flatten the sealing gasket or propel the oil pan back and forth repeatedly. Clamp the oil pan supporting block onto the oil pan and screw in the bolts with hands. Tighten the bolts to 35 Nm as the order shown in the figure, and then tighten the 4 bolts numbered 16, 12, and 3 again to 35 Nm in any order. Removing and installing the oil nozzle. Removing the oil nozzle. Unscrew the bolts and take out the oil nozzle from the crankcase. Installing the oil nozzle. Before assembly, check if the oil nozzle is unobstructed. Install the oil nozzle on the oil duct of crankcase. Screw in the bolts and tighten them to 15 Nm. Removing and installing the oil pump. Removing the oil pump. Unscrew the bolts. Dismantle the cover plate of oil pump. Remove the inner and outer rotors. Unscrew the bolts and then remove the inner rotor shaft and O-ring together. Installing the oil pump. Clean the oil pump of crankcase with cleaning agent and dry it with a blowgun. Place the oil pump bushing on the tooling, by which the oil pump bushing is pressed in. Note: align the oil hole on the oil pump bushing with that on the crankcase. Clean the oil pump chamber with a blowgun to ensure it is free from impurities or oil stains. Install the inner rotor shaft of the oil pump with pin onto the crankcase. Screw in and tighten the bolts to 65 Nm. Install the seal ring onto the inner rotor shaft. Mount the inner rotor gently onto the inner rotor shaft. Note the marked surface on the gear faces outward, and then mount the outer rotor in the same way. The inner and outer rotors shall rotate uniformly and smoothly. Install the oil pump cover plate onto the crankcase. Press it tightly. Screw in 9 M6 bolts and tighten them diagonally to 15 Nm. Measure the clearance between the outer rotor and oil pump cover plate, which shall range from 0.020 to 0.093 mm. Chapter 9. Crankcase Assembly. Removing and installing the flywheel housing. Removing the flywheel housing. Unscrew the fixing bolts of flywheel housing. And remove the flywheel housing. Installing the flywheel housing. Clean the junction surface between the rear end of crankcase and flywheel housing, on which the 5900 sealant is applied evenly and continuously. Press the rear oil seal of crankcase into the flywheel housing. Note: the edge of the oil seal shall bear the stress uniformly to prevent it from deformation. Know 2 locating pins into the rear end of crankcase. And install the guide bar and protective tooling for the rear oil seal of crankcase. Install the flywheel housing onto the crankcase along the guide bar. Screw in and tighten the bolts diagonally to 65 Nm for M10 bolt and to 280 Nm for M16 bolt. Removing and installing the cover plate. Removing the cover plate. Unscrew the fixing bolts of cover plate. Remove the cover plate and the sealing washer. Installing the cover plate. Clean the junction surface between the front cover plate and the crankcase, and apply 5900 sealant evenly at 1/3 on the upper part of the sealing zone. Knock in the locating pin of front cover plate at the front end of crankcase. Press the front oil seal of crankcase into the front cover plate. Note: the edge of the oil seal shall bear the stress uniformly to prevent it from deformation. After pressing, install the protection measures immediately to protect the lip of oil seal. Apply the lubricating oil evenly on the seal ring of fan bracket. Place the protective tooling of front oil seal at the front end of crankcase. Align the front cover plate spaced with sealing gasket with the locating pin. Install it at the front end of the crankcase and then tap the front cover plate with a rubber hammer gently, so that the front cover plate falls into its place, and screw in the bolts of front cover plate and tighten them with hands. Tighten M8 bolts to 30 Nm and M12 bolts to 110 Nm, and follow the principle of tightening diagonally during the tightening. Removing and installing the cylinder liner. Removing the cylinder liner. Use the cylinder liner extractor to remove the cylinder liner. And remove the O-ring seal from the crankcase. Installing the cylinder liner. Check the inner walls of the cylinder bore and check the steel groove within the cylinder bore for burr. Clean the spigot of cylinder bore and surface of cylinder liner and observe the inner walls of cylinder liner for scratches. First, measure the extrusion of cylinder liner and do not install the sealing ring at this point. When placing in the cylinder liner, install it vertically so that the cylinder head can fall down slowly to prevent collision. The text on the upper surface of the 6 cylinder liners shall face the same direction, pointing to the fan end of engine. Fix the cylinder liner to 80 Nm with tooling. Measure 4 directions for each cylinder liner, with the extrusion ranging from 0.035 mm to 0.085 mm. Find out the causes for beyond such range, and such cylinder liner shall not be used. Remove the fixing tool of the cylinder liner, take out the cylinder liner gently to prevent collision, and replace these cylinder liners in order. Clean the cylinder bore seal groove with cleaning agent, blow dry with an air gun. Leave no cleaning liquid to prevent the cleaning liquid from corroding the sealing ring. Clean the rubber gasket and check the gasket for deformation. Install the rubber gasket into the seal groove of cylinder bore with 2 rubber gaskets for each cylinder. Apply a little oil evenly on the seal ring of the cylinder liner with hands. Note: do not apply it with a brush or other tools to prevent falling impurities. Install the cylinder liners in turn according to the sequence and orientation of cylinder. When placing in the cylinder liner, install it vertically and hold the lower end of the cylinder liner with hands, so that the cylinder head can fall down slowly to prevent collision. Press into the cylinder liner forcibly and install it in place when you hear a sound "p." Chapter 10: Crank Link Mechanism. Remove and installing the shock absorber. Removing the shock absorber. Unscrew the fixing bolts and remove the shock absorber. Installing the shock absorber. Check the shock absorber for bump. Install the shock absorber hub onto the shock absorber. Screw in 9 bolts and tighten them diagonally to 45 Newton meters. Install the shock absorber at the front end face of engine crankshaft. Screw in 8 bolts and pre-tighten them to 150 Newton meters. And then turn 90 degrees. Remove and installing the flywheel. Removing the flywheel. Unscrew the fixing bolts of flywheel. And remove the flywheel and gear ring assembly. Installing the flywheel. Align the flywheel guide rod with the locating its pinhole. And install the flywheel at the rear end of the crankshaft. Apply a little lubricating oil onto the flywheel bolt support surface. Screw in and tighten 10 flywheel bolts. Tighten the flywheel bolts in 2 steps. First, tighten them diagonally with a torque of 100 Newton meters. Second, rotate the bolt at an angle of 90 degrees and tighten them diagonally. Removing and installing the piston and connecting rod. Removing the piston and connecting rod. Unscrew the bolts of connecting rod. Remove the connecting rod bearing cover and the connecting rod bearing. Pull the piston and the connecting rod out of the cylinder liner together. Note: protect the cranking surface of the connecting rod. Remove piston pin retaining ring. Piston pin and remove piston ring. Installing the piston and connecting rod. To install the piston ring, install the oil ring, taper face ring, and trapezoidal barrel faced ring in turn. Note: the top side of the taper face ring faces the top of piston. Note: the top side of trapezoidal barrel faced ring faces the top of the piston. Stagger the opening of the 3 piston rings with each other for 120 degrees in direction. Apply a little lubricating oil to the head of the piston pin and install the connecting rod assembly on the piston. Note: the arrow marked on the upper plane of piston is in the same direction as the oblique incision of the connecting rod. Insert the piston pin retaining ring. The piston pin snap ring is 1-off. Wipe out the connecting rod bearing seat and the connecting rod bearing. Install the connecting rod bearing into the connecting rod bearing seat. Note: pay attention to distinguish the upper and lower connecting rod bearing. Do not confuse them, as the upper one has an oil hole, while the lower one does not. Wrong installation may lead to block breaking and other vicious accident. Apply cleaning lubricant oil evenly on piston ring, small end of connecting rod bearing, inner wall of cylinder liner, and inner wall of mounting piston tooling, and install the piston into the cylinder liner with the tooling. The arrows on the top of the piston point to the fan end of the engine. Install the corresponding bearing cover on the connecting rod, and apply a little lubricating oil on the bolt supporting surface of the connecting rod bearing cover. Before tightening the bolts, pay attention that the cranking surface shall be tightly connected without dislocation. Tighten the connecting rod bolts in 3 steps. First, pre-tighten it to 10 Nm. Second, tighten it evenly to 100 plus or minus 10 Nm. Third, turn the bolt for 90 degrees to 100 degrees. Note, the connecting rod bolt is one-off. Check the axial clearance of connecting rod, 0.130 to 0.330 mm. Measure the extrusion of piston, 0.0235 to 0.3435 mm. Removing and installing the crankcase. Removing the crankcase. Unscrew the main bearing bolts and remove the crankcase cover and bearing bush. When taking out the 6th crankcase cover, take out the thrust plate at the same time. Place the crankcase cover removed in order. Pay attention to protect the cracking surface. If it is damaged, the entire crankcase assembly cannot be used anymore, and then lift out the crankcase. Installing the crankcase. Clean the spindle hole and cracking surface. Wipe dry the spindle hole with cleaning cloth, or blow dry with an air gun, or clean with a cleaner. Do not use cleaning cloth to wipe the cracking surface, but a cleaner shall be used. Clean the upper bush of the main bearing bush. Press the upper bush of the main bearing bush into the spindle hole. Clean the upper bush of the main bearing bush on which the detergent lubricant is applied evenly with fingers, but not too much, just forms a thin layer on it. Check the crankshaft oil hole for smoothness, and clean the crankshaft journal and rod journal. Fall the crankcase onto the spindle hole gently. Clean the thrust plate and install it at both sides of the 6th main bearing. Note, the side of thrust plate with oil groove shall face the crankcase. Clean the lower bush of the main bearing bush and crankcase cover. Clean the cracking surface of the crankcase cover. Install the lower bush of the main bearing bush on the crankcase cover. Apply detergent lubricant evenly on such lower bush with fingers, but not too much, just form a thin layer on it. Install the crankcase cover on the crankcase. Install the thrust plate at both sides of the 6th crankcase cover. When installing the crankcase cover, note that the number on the crankcase cover of the first main bearing shall be the same as that on the crankcase, and the first figure of the number on the rest crankcase cover shall be the same as the number of the corresponding main bearing. Apply a little lubricating oil on the bolt supporting surface of the crankcase cover. Before tightening the bolt, pay attention that the cracking surface shall be tightly connected without dislocation. Tighten the main bearing bolts by hands. Tighten the bolts in 4 steps, after tightening them to 50 Nm, 150 Nm, and 300 Nm respectively. Mark on the bolts and turn them for 90 to 100 degrees. Note, the main bearing bolts are one-off with no reuse allowed. Rotate the crankcase after tightening. It shall be flexible to rotate, without stagnation. Measure the axial clearance of crankshaft, which shall range from 0.2 mm to 0.401 mm. Removing and installing the front drive gear. Removing the front drive gear. Unscrew the bolts and remove the fan holder assembly. Unscrew the bolts and remove the intermediate gear and intermediate gear shaft. Installing the front drive gear. Dip your hand in some clean lubricating oil and apply it evenly on the junction surface of the crankshaft front gear and crankshaft. Fix the front gear with a process bolt and knock in the front gear with a rubber hammer gently. Install the intermediate gear. The side with machining marks at the root of the intermediate gear faces the crankcase. Check whether the gear rotates smoothly. Apply a little clean lubricating oil on the intermediate gear shaft evenly. Install the intermediate gear shaft. Align the bolt hole of the intermediate gear shaft with the bolt hole of the crankcase. Screw in the bolts and tighten them to 115 Nm. Install the fan holder assembly on the front end of the crankcase. Screw in 5 bolts, among which the M8 x 40 bolt is installed at the bolt holes with locating sleeve, and the other 4 bolt holes are for M8 x 25. Tighten them diagonally to 35 Nm. Check the clearance of front gear train. Axial clearance of fan drive shaft, 0.2 to 0.55 mm. Clearance between the intermediate gear and the fan gear, 0.054 to 0.246 mm. Clearance between the crankshaft front gear and the intermediate gear, 0.057 to 0.183 mm. Clearance between the crankshaft front gear and the outer rotor of oil pump, 0.092 to 0.272 mm.